Tawau, Tansatauia Kakiao Kiawau, Candace Savage Nitsigatson, Grand Prairie Kiwik no Kayate Nituchin Maga, Misasquatumen Atik Aski, Megwach Nawikan. My name is Candace Savage, and it is a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Wild About Saskatoon to tonight's Nature City conversation, all about starting native plants from seed. I speak only a very little Cree, Apsis Ninahewan, just enough really to be able to introduce myself. But it's an honor to be able to do so as a way of holding a little space for Naheawewan and other Indigenous languages to be heard everywhere and every day. Again, bringing that beauty back here to Treaty 6 territory and the home of the Métis people. Tonight, we're going to hear from our dream team of native plant experts, Chet Neufeld, Renny Griltz, and Sandra Walker. If you attended last year's conversation about the whys and hows of growing native plants, they will be familiar faces. If you missed that guide, it's not too late. There's a link to it in the chat and on the Wild About Saskatoon website. We can't all return buffalo to our little pieces of the prairie ecosystem, but we can welcome home the plants that belong here. We can bring that beauty home. Last spring, Wild About Saskatoon launched Pollinator Paradise YXC with that objective in mind, to celebrate and encourage the return of native plants to our boulevards, balconies, gardens, and parks as an expression of relationship and respect. If you haven't registered your garden yet, please look into it, again, on the website. We have a beautiful sign waiting for you. Tonight, we are going to hear from each of our speakers in turn and then open the floor for questions. But there's no need to wait. If you've come with questions, please drop them in the chat at any time, and we will get to as many of them as we can. Now, to introduce our speakers. Chet Neufeld was born and raised in Swift Current and earned his Bachelor of Science from the University of Lethbridge. He specializes in plant ecology, and his work over the years has included projects dealing with climate change and native grasses, restoration of native prairie, rare plant surveys, seed bank studies, and invasive species management. He is a founder of the Saskatchewan Invasive Species Council and the executive director of the Native Plants Society of Saskatchewan and a mainstay of Wild About Saskatoon. Our second speaker will be Renny Griltz, who has spent his career working throughout the Canadian prairies, conserving and managing ecologically significant areas for wildlife, biodiversity, and sustainable land uses. He was raised on a family farm near St. Benedict, Saskatchewan, and holds an honors BSc in agriculture from the University of Saskatchewan, with a major in plant ecology and a minor in crop science. His parents, in the early 1990s, started Blazing Star Wildflower Seed Company as a way to diversify their farm. Blazing Star is now run by Renny's wife, Lisa, and he is appearing on our panel tonight as the face of Blazing Star. And our third speaker will be Sandra Walker, who was born in Ontario, but who has spent most of her life in and around Saskatoon. She kindled her interest in wild plants when she was working as a tree planter and cooking on a solar stove in the wilderness. She has a double honors degree in archaeology and anthropology and fine arts from the University of Saskatchewan and works as a program facilitator, ethnobotanist, and archaeologist at Saskatoon's Brightwater Science, Environmental, and Indigenous Learning Center. She is also the author of this important book, The Path to wild foods. So, Chet, you're first up. Over to you.
Okay. I'm just going to share my presentation now. Okay. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of some of the easy to grow plants. Some of you have been growing native plants for a while. Some of you may have some of these plants in your yard already, and that's great. This is more geared towards the first timer. I want this to be a positive experience for everybody. So you pretty much can't lose with any of my recommendations here. They're very hard to kill, and they thrive on neglect. And I've got most of these growing in my yard as well. So the picture here that we're looking at is blue-eyed grass.
Sorry, Chet, we have a technical difficulty. Your screen isn't showing.
Oh, it's not showing, hey? Oh, let's try this again then. Okay.
Okay, it's coming up.
Can everybody see this now?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Great. Okay. So the first species I'll talk about, and I'm kind of going by the conditions in your yard. So the first plant species I'll talk about are for dry, sunny areas, maybe those southern-facing exposures. This one is prairie coneflower. I really like it. It's super easy to grow from seed. It's got a very unusual flower where the petals are reflex, so they kind of look like little rockets taking off. The birds really like the seed. They just devour it, finches especially in the fall. And it produces a lot of showy flowers. You can see right at the bottom of the photo here, I've got some wood chips. If you have too thick of a layer, it will exclude those seeds from germinating. I've got the wood chips to keep the weeds down in the flower bed. So I actually have to kind of scratch an area out around the mature plants so they can reseed themselves in that area. They otherwise wouldn't be able to. And you know that seed is ready to harvest when, well, obviously the petals will have withered and fallen off, but you can just gently pinch those seed heads and the seed should fall off right in your fingers. So it's a pretty easy little plant to grow. So you've got the prairie coneflower that I just talked about on the left. A couple of other flowers that will more or less do the same job as far as being easy to grow, liking the same place in your yard and looking similar would be something like gaillardia. Another name for that is blanket flower. And then black-eyed Susan up on the right. Another great plant is wild flax. Looks almost exactly like the agricultural flax that you sometimes see growing in fields. It blooms a lot. You can see this is just one plant. It's a massive plant. It's bigger than it would normally be in the wild because it's getting a tiny bit more moisture in my yard, and it's taking advantage of every drop of that extra moisture. It's very drought tolerant, actually. So this looks more prolific than it would in the wild, but that's fine. It looks great. Attracts a ton of bees, and it will self-seed, but not to the point of being weedy. And again, I have some wood mulch in this picture, and I actually have to scratch it away so it will self-seed. Otherwise, those seeds won't make it down. They need to actually contact the soil. Sorry. And there you can see the wild flax on the right. This is right by my front step. And you can see black-eyed Susan on the left. And if you were to go any further, you'd actually see the prairie coneflower as well. So you can see how I've used it in combination in my yard. Another one that's very easy to grow and really likes those dry, full sun areas is Philadelphia fleabane. It's a lower growing plant, might get 8-10 inches high, lots of blooms. When the first bloom comes out, you'll see bees all over it. They really love it. And as it blooms more and more, it will really attract pollinators. Spreads only by seed, so it behaves really well in a garden setting. prairie onion. I love this plant. It is super tough. I'll show you a picture coming up, and it's kind of one of those wow moments. It likes those hot and dry areas as well. I don't think it could ever be too hot and dry. I've got it in a raised flower bed, and it does really well amongst other low-growing species. This is a fairly low-growing species, maybe 6 inches high. Sandra will probably talk about its edibility, although all parts of it are edible. Even the seed smells oniony. It's got an onion smell to it. And it will self-seed if it gets a little bit of bare earth. I've even got some growing in my native lawn. I've got blue grama and June grass for a lawn, and it grows amongst it. And then you get these happy little white flowers popping up amongst the grass. So there's the picture showing you just how hardy it is. It's growing out of a hole in a rock. There's probably very little soil in there, and it's getting blasted by the sun every single day, and it's blooming. Here's a really stunning little plant that's fairly easy to grow, showy loco weed. I've got this growing in a raised bed right next to my onions. So it's kind of about the same height as the wild onions, maybe a little taller. The really interesting part about this plant is that it's so densely hairy. It's got this silvery kind of sage-like quality to the leaves. And that alone is interesting enough. And then when it blooms, it gets these bright pinky purple blossoms. And it looks really great. The bees flock to it. The butterflies flock to it. And the only thing you have to worry about as far as growing this or any other legumes that have a hard seed coat is that it needs scarification. I think Renny's going to talk about this, but it just needs to have the seed scuffed a little bit so that the moisture can enter that hard seed coat. Otherwise, you'll be waiting years for it to germinate. Showy milkweed is another one. I'll caution anybody living in a small city yard about this one. I would suggest you not plant this. If you have an acreage or a farm or something like that where it's got room to roam, I think that's great. Milkweeds are known as the only food of the monarch butterfly caterpillar. That's super important. Monarch butterflies are increasingly threatened, and we need to support them when they do make their journey up through here. This one is very easy to grow, very robust. It grows in the driest parts of our province, so there is no place too dry for this. I've seen it grow along gravel road shoulders and things like that. So that's another great one. There are less aggressive milkweeds if you're in a yard. I'm in a yard in Saskatoon. I grow world milkweed. There's also low milkweed, which is less aggressive, and I think it's called swamp milkweed. So those are less aggressive milkweed species. So there it is in all of its different stages. The ones up at the top are actually the seed pod forming and the seed pod bursting. So you can see even after it flowers, there's still some interest to the plant. And then happy little monarch caterpillar gonna munch down on it on the bottom left. Western Canada violet is a great ground cover. It's got tiny, tiny seeds, but they readily grow. And once you get one plant established, Western Canada violet will send out rhizomes, so underground creeping stems that will form patches, and they're beautiful little ground cover plants. If you don't want that spreading nature, or if you want a different color, early blue violet is just a little bunch plant. It doesn't spread by rhizomes, it only spreads by seed, and it blooms probably the earliest of all of our violets, or one of the earliest of our violets. And then downy yellow violet, that's actually provincially rare in Saskatchewan, that I've got growing in a couple of places in my yard, and it does really well. It's a little taller, little lusher. Another species that does really well in shade, and I've got all of those violet species I mentioned growing right around this plant. This is giant hyssop. Some people call it anise hyssop, and that's because it's got a licorice smell to it and a licorice flavor to it. I think I won't steal any of Sandra's thunder on this one. She'll probably talk about it. But if you come to my yard, my child will try and feed this to you. He knows that this is a good plant to eat, and he'll serve it to all the visitors, whether they like it or not. And it has a really strong black licorice smell and taste, and attracts pollinators like crazy. This plant will just be vibrating with pollinators when it's in full bloom. Another kind of a different flower, because you don't have very many red native flowers, and this one hangs down instead of facing up like most do. Wild columbine. Most people are familiar with columbines. There's horticultural varieties of all sorts of different shades and sizes and everything, but this is one of our native ones. And the other nice thing about this is it's got those long upturned spurs that you see kind of making a crown at the top of the flower. Those actually hold the nectar, and so it actually attracts hummingbirds as well, and they're one of the few things that can get their tongue up in there to get at the nectar. There's a few bee species that can force their way up in there as well. It produces a lot of seeds. So once you have a mature plant producing seed, you'll never have a problem with finding a source for wild columbine seed again. That being said, they're not weedy. They will self-seed, but not to the point of ever taking over. A very showy plant, planted amongst things or on its own. Meadow blazing star, we're moving from the shade out into the light, but this one needs moisture just like those shady area plants do. It needs a little bit of moisture, not a ton. This one's meadow blazing star. It blooms a little later in the season, so after kind of your early summer plants have gone, this one is really attractive in your landscape. It's easy to grow from seed, but it will not bloom the first year. Most of these plants that I've talked about will not bloom the first year. They're usually setting up roots and establishing themselves. So the second year is probably when you'll find most of these plants bloom. This one for sure. Wild bergamot, same thing. It'll bloom in the second year. The first year is going to be an establishment year. It likes those sunny and moist areas. It can tolerate quite a bit of dryness. It only spreads by seed, forms quite a tall bush-like flower. The ones in my yard are about knee-high, quite nice, and attracts pollinators like crazy. And also edible, has kind of a peppery oregano-like taste to the flowers. And then I threw some grasses in here just because a lot of people don't think of grasses as good for pollinators, and these ones are. They attract quite a few different types of butterflies, often in their larval form as a food plant. So this is one of the grasses I mentioned I have growing in my yard as a lawn grass. It grows readily from seed, and you don't really have to do much once they're established. It will spread very slowly by very short rhizomes, so it will take a long time to fill in an area if you don't seed it thickly enough. This is the other grass I have in my lawn. Main grass I have in my lawn is June grass. It does best in June, hence its name. It looks like it does in the picture in kind of mid to late June. Grows readily from seed. This one is a bunch grass, so it's good for either filling in areas in your lawn or even as a low kind of specimen grass, or if you wanted to plant a short border of this grass. It looks fantastic. Little blue stem. This one just showed up in my yard. I didn't intentionally plant it. It's a common grass in Saskatchewan. This one's a host for a bunch of different skipper species. Skippers are tiny little butterflies. And this is it later in the season where it turns this kind of a bronzy color, really attractive plant, especially as a specimen grass. Easy to grow from seed. Most of these grass species are easy to grow from seed. And there's a close-up of one of the seed heads, really feathery type of seed head. Here's some other easy to grow species, just because I don't have forever to go through. I could talk for a day and a half on all of my favorite easy grow native wildflowers, but there you have a number of them there. They all grow very readily from seed. There's nothing special that you have to do to them necessarily. And for all of these species in general, if you're planting them any deeper than 1/4 of an inch, you're planting them too deep. Some of them just have to be pressed right into the surface and can be exposed. Some of them have to be just slightly buried, but definitely no deeper than 1/4 of an inch, or what would that be in centimeters, like 1/2 centimeter or less? So there's a number of the different species that I talked about in my front yard, just to show you some context. If you're looking for producers and providers of native seed, just go to our website, and then you'll find under info resources, if you click info resources at the top, you'll find our native seed producer list, or if you click on native plant sources, you'll also find this list. This is a really great book. Nora Stewart was a native seed and plant grower for a number of years, and she condensed her decades worth of knowledge into this book. We sell it on our website, but most major bookstores do as well. And Native Plants for Prairie Gardens by June Flanagan is a standard as well. Sold on our website and major bookstores. If you want to go see some native plant displays or gardens, these are some of the public ones. Obviously, people have private ones, such as, well, all of us presenters. But these are some great ones to check out. The Allen Sapp Gallery is in either Battleford or North Battleford. I can't remember which one. And Nagik, maybe Sandra can talk about that one. She's helping them develop a native plant or medicinal plant garden. And there's me if you need to get a hold of me. All right. Next up is Renny. Take it away.
Okay, thanks, Chet. I'm going to try and share my screen. And can you see my PowerPoint? Chet or Candice, can you tell me if you see this or not?
We could see it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Chet, and for that good overview of the different wildflowers that you're growing in your yard. And thanks, Candice, for the great introduction. Yeah, my name is Renny Grills, and my family owns Blazing Star Wildflower Seed Company. And this is actually our 30th year in business. And like Candice said, my parents started as a farm diversification business back in the early 90s. And I've had the pleasure of continuing on the family business and working with my children as well on running the business. As you can see with wildflowers, they have a huge diversity. So when you're out walking the prairie, you see that diversity of the flowers and what they look like. But if you take a closer look at the flowers themselves or the seeds, there's a huge diversity as well. Some have really fine, really hard-coated seeds that are really hard, like the legumes. Some have really fluffy awns on them that flow in the wind, like the goldenrods. And some are more adapted, like wild licorice, where they have burrs, which animals transport them that way. So each individual wildflower has a totally different way of getting established and growing. And knowing those little tricks really makes it easier to figure out a way to get them to grow. Also, when you get them started, quite often they don't look the same as the plant that you find out in nature, because when you see them in nature, they're usually 3, 4, 5 years old. They're really mature. They're in full bloom when you notice them. But when you start them in the house or in your yard, they're really tiny plants. And like Chet had said, they're perennials. Most of them are perennials. So they usually don't flower until year 2, year 3, or year 4. And knowing how to start them and how to nurture them, and then also what they look like in that first year, that first 6 months, so that you don't accidentally pull them out as weeds when you have them growing in your wildflower bed. So it's these little nuances. And Chet had mentioned Nora Stewart's book. I highly recommend that book for anyone wanting to get into growing native plants. She has some really good tricks and guidelines on how to grow these native plants from seeds. So how do you get seeds? So, there are, like Chet said, with the Native Plant Society, there are listings of some of the different companies in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba that supply native plant seeds and plant material. But also you can go out and collect the seed yourself. You can go out when you're out in the fall, hiking the prairie. You could take a little seed head of something like in the middle here, that's bergamot, and you can just, collect that little seed head, take it back, clean it out, and you have some seeds. Or you can go on the one picture on the side in the ice cream pail there. That is one of the legumes. And so you actually shell them as pods. The other picture on their side in the paper bag and in the trays below is what prairie crocus seed looks like. And so in late, they usually flower in April, mid to late April, then come mid to late May, you see these little awns, and that's the seed that you collect. So there's little, you can go out and harvest the seed yourself. Now, one warning though is when you're out collecting seed, make sure you know whose land you're doing it on, get permission from the landowner, or if you're on a protected site, quite often bylaws don't allow for collecting plants and seeds. So just sort of want to give that warning. But I find quite often road ditches are a great place for collecting seed. So Chet covered some of the different species, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just highlight some of those species and talk about how to get them started. So this is the prairie crocus. So this is the first flower that's seen every spring. And you see those, the first picture shows the flowers. The second picture is shown when it is gone to seed. And the third picture is actually the seed itself. When it's ready to harvest, you can actually just pluck that little puff of seeds, and they pull off. In this picture, they're still shiny, so that means the seed isn't ripe yet. But when they're ripe, you just touch it and the seeds start falling off. And the trick for getting this one started is taking the seed, and you see that awn on the seed. So you put the seed in the ground, and you leave the awn sticking out. And this seed will sometimes go into dormancy depending on when you harvest it or when the seed was collected. If it's freshly harvested seed in the spring, typically it germinates right away. If not, it might sit in dormancy for a while. But when it breaks the dormancy, it actually corkscrews itself into the soil. And it's really interesting to watch. If you've ever done the wild oats experiment in school, very similar processes. When it starts to germinate, it corkscrews itself into the soil. So this picture is actually of a prairie crocus after 2 weeks of germination. So you can see the awn on the one tray here. You can see that awn still sticking out, but in this one, you see the two false leaves on the bottom, the two cotyledons, and then you have that center stalk coming up. Now, the one challenge with crocus, it takes up to 3 years before you get a flower from that plant. Chet mentioned bergamot, which is a native mint, and you can see the flower, nice purple, usually flowers in July into August. And then when it's done flowering, it produces that nice little brown seed head. And when that seed is ripe, you can just walk by and you can tap it, and the seed will come out onto your hand. And those little tiny seeds can be planted out, either out in your garden that you want to grow them, or keep them for the spring when you want to start them inside. And germination is really simple. You just scatter the seed on the surface, lightly cover them with some soil no deeper than half a centimeter, and they'll germinate from that. Purple prairie clover. So this is a native legume, and it's quite often used in a lot of restoration projects. Also, this is really loved by pollinators and bees. The bees just go wild for this plant, and it has a nice sweet smell. And when the seed's ready, the flower is done flowering, and then that middle stalk turns into a nice brown color. And then you can just pluck the seed pods off. So the third picture here actually shows the seed, which is the light brown color. And then those little pods is the individual pod for each seed, because it's a legume, it has a natural pod with it. And so you can either you don't have to necessarily remove the pods from the seed to get it to germinate. You can get them started that way. And what we find is soaking the seed overnight for 24 hours in warm water, not hot water, but warm water, really help the germination. So that process is called scarification. So if you've ever heard about scarification in gardening books, is that process of getting that hard seed coat nicked or softened to help getting water into it to stimulate germination. So something small like purple prairie clover, soaking it in water works really well. Some of the larger seeds like buffalo bean is fairly large. It's a small bean seed. And that one, some people rough it with sandpaper or nick it with a knife to allow that water to get in to cause germination. So that is called scarification. And so this is a picture of purple prairie clover after 2 weeks after germination. You can see it turns into a real big carpet. And you can see the 2 false leaves, the cotyledons, and then that three-leaved clover coming out. Dotted blazing star. This is another beautiful fall wildflower. One of the, with the purple flowers, when it's done flowering, you have those individual seeds, pods, or clumps of seeds. And when they're ready, you can just pluck them out really lightly. And that's what the seeds look like. One of the things we find with the blazing star is there's a lot of insect damage on those seeds. So if you actually take a look at the seed really closely, quite often there's a little hole in it. And that's insects using the dotted and the meadow blazing star for food. And the easy way to get this one started is you take the seed, put it into the ground, and you have that tail sticking up, and it'll start to germinate, and then it'll actually push those hairs off, and then they'll fall over to the side. So it's a really interesting one to watch when you're germinating. Western red lily. So this is the provincial flower of Saskatchewan. Some other names are the fire lily, or some people call them the tiger lily. And flowers, usually I find they flower right before July long weekend, depending where you are in Saskatchewan. And then the flowers disappear. And then come mid-October, all of a sudden you find the seed pods, and they're this straw color. And there's the seed pods with them. And within those seed pods are those little flakes, and those are the individual seeds. And so this is a lily plant, and so it's really delicate leaves with that papery seed coating. And this one requires a special form of germination called stratification. So there's 2 terms: scarification, whereas with you damage that seed coat to germinate. The other one is stratification, where you give it a seed treatment. So some stratification requires cold treatment, so much time with cold or moist conditions, sometimes cool conditions. In terms of Western red lily, this one, all it requires is moist, humid conditions with a little bit of heat. So how we get this one started is we take the seed, put it in vermiculite, and in a Ziploc bag, and keep it moist. And then you can see it start. This middle picture, you see that little tail, the root coming out, and then the third picture is the cotyledon popping out. And so that's the germination of Western red lily. And what it does is that bottom heat really stimulates that stratification. So there's 2 different ways of doing that. One is using on the fridge, and that's what we use. Or the old fridges gave off a lot of heat, so then we use that as a heat source. Or something simple like a heating mat that you can buy at any garden center, like Early's in Saskatoon or Lee Valley. And if anyone grows tomatoes, a lot of people use that for that bottom heat for tomatoes, and works really good for Western red lily as well. This is a Western red lily after 4 years, and the root is actually a corm with individual scales. And over time, once you build up that corm, you could break off those individual scales and start another plant from those individual scales. Chet mentioned showing milkweed and how aggressive it can be from a root system, but also when the pods are ripe, they burst open and shoot out those seeds with those fine hairs that float the seed all over the place, and that's how it spreads. And if you take those individual seeds, it's very similar to the Western red lily and has that sort of that papery seed coat around it. And for germination, what this one requires is that bottom heat as well. So you start the seed in your container that you're starting the plants, and you give it that bottom heat. And that really gets the germination going and gets the plants established. So this is a picture of a 3-week-old plant. One of the things that we found with milkweed, though, is a lot of people want to start their milkweeds early, like all their plants, it's wintertime, you want to get your plants started early. But with milkweeds, if you put them outside in the beginning of May, the cooler temperatures at night really do a lot of damage to the plants. So if you're going to start milkweed, highly recommend starting it later in the season, probably early April into May inside the house. And then if you do it outside and plant it in May. So this is a picture of, sorry about the phone. This is a picture of our front yard. We have different wildflowers growing in our yard and sort of that diversity in colors and heights. So one of the things that we start our wildflowers in the house with is we do them in a root trainer. And the reason we use a root trainer is because it allows for the root systems to go down on these plants and they come out to the bottom and they naturally prune themselves, air prune. Plus also they spiral down and they don't get root bound. And you can buy these places like in Saskatoon at Lee Valley carries them. I think I've seen them at Early's at one time as well. And it's a really great way to get native plants established because you're thinking about a native plant, 80% or 90% of the biomass of a native plant is usually in the root system. So really focusing on getting that root system growing is quite important. So with that, I'll pass it over to Sandra. And I'll see if I can figure out how to stop sharing.
You could leave your pictures up there, they're nice. I don't have any beautiful flower pictures. I'm going to bore people with words. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to address why do this kind of thing. Mainly, native prairie is one of the most rapidly disappearing natural landscapes on Earth due to human development, and there's only a small fragment of it left. We've left our imprint on one open, vast, pristine wilderness. Native prairie is one of the Earth's major biomes, and it is one of the most productive and diverse terrestrial systems. Native prairie provides crucial sustenance, breeding, and revitalizing habitat for incredibly diverse variety of wildlife, including pollinators such as butterflies and birds. Many butterflies depend on special plants for their larvae, such as milkweed, for rare monarchs. So you can help their cause by including these native plants in your garden. Monarchs chose my yard one year to breed, and it's a real treat because when they hatch, they're very vibrant in color. Most miraculous things too. I still have milkweed, and if I see 2 holes, I don't eat my milkweed that year because it's there for the monarchs in that case. In general, butterflies flock to bright-colored nectar rich flowers, such as purple prairie clover, coneflower, blazing stars, glardias, and scarlet mallow.
Sandra, Sandra, we know that you have some audio problems. Could you bring the phone closer to you so we can hear you more easily, please?
Is that a little bit better?
Yes.
Okay. Many people use bird feeders to attract birds. Other ways of attracting birds are utilizing native plants in your landscape. Prairie plants, once established, can easily embrace the wide variety of weather conditions. They are adapted to the local environment and easy to maintain. As an example, native prairie plants require much less care and can help conserve water. Once established, they put deep roots down, enrich the soils, and don't require bathing and constant watering. They can handle seasonal rains, droughts, and harsh winters. Native prairie is native plants in gardens also attract a source of seeds and helps keep local wild areas populated with native plants. They spread by wind, water, and wildlife, and help reestablish conservative areas and local parklands. Unfortunately, many of popular plants in today's gardening are imports from other parts of the world. One of the long-standing problems with ornamentals is these plants escape cultivation and can spread unchecked throughout wild areas and invade natural habitats. Ensuring that plants in our landscapes are not invasive will help solve this problem. Native gardens, even small, can provide a bridge to nearby remaining wild areas. A variety of landscaping prairies is vast and varies from full sun to partly shade to shade, as well as the diverse soil conditions, wetlands, and aquatic habitats. Limits on what you can do in your yard to mimic these variations are potentially endless. For instance, you can include cactus in dry areas of your yard, maybe supplement a little bit of sand into the soil, small ponds, and even rock-filled swale areas below your east top downspout. Small plants of well-chosen native plants in urban, suburban landscapes can provide critical habitat for a wide variety of birds, pollinators, and other beneficial insects, even reptiles and amphibians. We had a frog hop into our greenhouse and live there for quite a while, actually, and taking advantage of the insects too. So that's kind of fun. I tend to choose plants that give the greatest culinary possibility that suit the variety of habitats that I have made in my yard. It makes sense to utilize wild plants that are well adapted to survive here. I now take seeds out from some of my favorite wild spaces around the city and share seeds with those who wish to have native plants in the yard. Communities is not just apply to humans. If we take care of nature, nature will take care of us. And you can even register your yard for the official Monarch Way Station as well, and with us, because we have our own paradise. If anybody has any questions, we can answer them now, I think.
So, perfect. Amanda, can we all be seen now? Those of you who are watching this, okay, we're seeing a slightly different screen than you are, so we don't always know exactly what's going on. Thank you all for those presentations. I'd never really thought about the importance of grasses for rearing caterpillars, and I hadn't really thought about all the diversity of seeds and all those different the ways they look, and so I have something new to explore and appreciate now. So for so many reasons, grateful for everything that you have offered us. We do have questions, but I have one first, and that is, are there plants that you would start now indoors? Renny, maybe you could take that.
Thanks, Candace. Yeah, actually, we typically start our wildflowers on Valentine's Day. That's sort of our start date for some of our wildflowers. So depending on what the species, if it's something a little slower growing, that's when we start them. We're typically looking at things like the prairie crocus right now, or maybe black-eyed Susan, Gaillardia, bergamot is when we sort of start those now. Like I mentioned in my presentation, something like the milkweeds that get a little bit bigger and faster, we wait till later into the season before starting. So yeah, it depends what you have available and what your setup is for starting. So I know some people get really excited for starting plants. I know a few people that have already started their tomatoes, and by beginning of May, they want to get them outside, but we still got frost. So that's one thing you got to start thinking about too, is if you start them early, what do you do with them in that cold weather in May? So, But yeah, it's always fun to watch them, especially in the wintertime. Watch these little seedlings coming up. It's always fun to watch.
So we have a question here from the chat. I'm curious about the winter sowing method for starting native seeds, often using plastic milk jugs. Any comments about this method in our climate zone? That's news to me, so I'm afraid I can't elaborate. Do you know what that method is? We might have to ask the asker to give us some more information, because it sounds like this is something we're not familiar with.
Renny, you might have to take this one. I'm familiar with the method, but it's mostly down in, like I'm on some Facebook pages for Midwestern United States native plant groups, and it's where their winters don't get cold enough to really damage anything. They get these big, milk cartons or plastic milk jugs, and they'll just put the seed in soil there, and then when spring comes, nature will kind of take its course and get these seedlings going, and then I think they split the cartons off, or they cut the bottoms out and put them into the ground. I'm really I take the lazy method of gardening. I do a few seeds in root trainers like Renny does. It's quite labor intensive because you have to keep these little thirsty things alive all the time, and I'm busy doing a lot of different things. I only really do that if I have just a few seeds that I need to guarantee are going to survive to adulthood. And that I can keep, insects and those kind of things away from them, control a few more variables. But generally, I'll just throw my seed out in the fall, or even in the spring, and just kind of let it go. And I think the milk jug approach is kind of a hybrid approach to that. It's not quite starting them indoors in root trainers, and it's not just kind of throwing the seed down and letting it do its thing.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on Chet. It's probably one of those more practices that you find down south. Here, we're pretty good in the wintertime that if you sow them sort of after that Thanksgiving, around Halloween time, perfect time for planting them in the fall, right before freeze up, get them frozen into the ground solid, and hope you don't get a nice February melt like what we had today. But it should, get them, those seeds right into the ground, freeze them in over the winter, and then they'll be great, ready to start in the spring for germination. One of the challenges, though, too, with the fall planting is if you get that early spring, things start germinating and growing. And then if you get a late season frost and one of those killer frosts, you can damage those seedlings as well. So, it's sort of a hit and miss with the fall plantings, depending on your location. Typically, your better option is probably spring. Sort of that May long weekend is sort of the rule of thumb that we tell people. I don't know, Sandra, do you have any suggestions on that?
Most of mine I start in the spring, and I use eggshells. And then give them a squish and plant them straight in the ground.
And if anyone, Sandra has a video about her eggshell planting. So,
the Wildlife Saskatoon YouTube channel. We'll have to post it again on Facebook. You really haven't lived till you've seen Sandra in person.
Not as serious as I look.
Another question for you. If you can see insect holes in a seed, does that mean that it's been eaten and won't likely germinate?
Yeah, won't germinate if you see the holes in them. That's the insect going after the embryo of the seed and going in there for some food, and 9 times out of 10 that seed won't germinate. So, but it shows you the value of these native plants for different species, right? So you're out there looking at that flower and you don't see those little tiny insects that are harvesting those, providing that food for that plant, or using the plant for food, sorry. Yeah.
And of course, that's the whole motivation, or one of the motivations for growing these plants is that in so many ways they support the whole ecosystem. They're supporting insects, which support birds, and whatever is going on in the soil won't be happening in the same way without those plants that belong here.
Yeah.
Someone wants to know, to plant native grasses, do you have to dig out your non-native grass first? I'm afraid I know the answer to that question.
Yes, but you can do it in steps. I was fairly lucky when I got my house. It was just on a bare dirt lot, like dirt, not soil, but just that B horizon. So I actually had to bring topsoil in and start from a clean slate. If you've got Kentucky bluegrass, which is typically what you have in your lawn, it's really aggressive and it will quickly take over any area that you would seed with native grasses because they're slower to establish. They like to direct a lot of their energy towards incredibly deep roots. But they'll eventually lose the battle against Kentucky bluegrass just because it's so aggressive and invasive. So what you do have to do is, yes, take all of that out. Or if you want to keep a portion of your lawn and try a different portion to native grass, that's fine. Boulevards do really well with native grass because native grass can take a lot of punishment. Salt from the roads, lots of dry, hot conditions. I've got a lot of native species doing really well in my little boulevard area. And then I've got my whole front and back kind of lawn area to that. But yeah, some people I've talked through the process of doing it in Saskatoon and just to make it easier on them, I tell them to break their yard up into manageable chunks and maybe just use some pound-in edging or some kind of root barrier to separate the two at the time. I even have to do that for mine, even though my whole yard is more or less native species. My neighbors aren't, and they have Kentucky bluegrass lawn, so I have to find these physical barriers to keep their roots from encroaching into my yard. So yes, you do have to remove that existing grass. You can't plant into it.
And then if you got quackgrass in your lawn, like what I have, that's you got to deal with that when coming in with an aggressive that rhizomatous root that comes in. And so what we use we have part of it that we've kept as lawn, but the other part of it we keep sort of lawn edging, going around with the lawn edger a couple times a week and just sort of break those roots up as they're trying to sneak into the patch, and then go in and pull quackgrass roots out periodically, usually after it rains, because it's nice and easy to pull out then. So
that sounds like fun.
Yeah,
so you can't escape from weeding, hey?
We've been doing this for about 10 years now, and we do a quick walkthrough after it rains, and it takes like 2 minutes, so it's not too bad. We don't have any other weeds that we have to deal with, though. So
yeah. I noticed.
I use a rock trim.
Oh, sorry.
So I use a rock trim around my areas, and then you can always remove the rock and easily pull out the plants that are growing that you don't want in that rock area. Helps hold moisture too. Sorry, Candace, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, that's fine. I've forgotten what I was going to say. Oh yes, now I remember. Chet, a couple of times you mentioned using wood chips as mulch. Do you use that?
Yeah, I mean, as a weed barrier, mostly, I don't need the mulch to hold the moisture in because all of my plants that are around the wood chips don't necessarily need added moisture. They're pretty drought tolerant, but just to keep the weeds down. There are, let's see, there's wood chips on my raised beds, and I have quite a few of those areas. And then in my kind of shade forest understory garden, I've got some as well. And that does, those plants in there do need a little bit more moisture. They're used to growing in a forest understory, which is naturally a little more moist, but not to any great degree. I think I might at the most have something like an inch of wood chips in that area, and then less, maybe a half an inch or something like that on my raised beds. And that seems to suffice. But there are other areas where I have none, and they do just fine. Yeah.
I have to admit that in our yard, we've used wood chips in some places, especially where we've been afflicted with creeping bellflower, just to try to make space and get things established. Here's another question for you. Is there anywhere that sells the plant versus the seed? Wow, there's a leading question.
Renny sells both. So there's my local plug for Blazing Star. If you go to our PDF on our website, it gives you an initial list of all of the suppliers, but there's a really useful appendix that tells you species by species. If you're looking for Gaillardia, for example, you go under wildflower, look it up by the scientific name, which also happens to be Gaillardia aristata, and then it would give you a bunch of numbers and S or P and S and or P behind each number. And the number is linked to the provider, and S is seed and P is plant. So our list will tell you who provides what, and if it's seeds and or plants. Yeah.
Oh, Candace, you're muted.
The Zoom's in. We have a bunch of questions and only a few minutes, but I find it hard to find scarlet mallow seeds. Any suggestions? Do you sell it, Renny?
We try and harvest the seed, and quite often we find it with insect damage. We do have a little bit, but we're sort of keeping it for ourselves for our production plots kind of thing. So nothing yet, but definitely check Native Plant Society's list service.
So harvest some yourself ethically late in the summer when it's ready. Where can one find pictures of the seedlings of native plants?
Nora Stewart's book that Chet mentioned has really good photographs of all the individual seedlings. So that's probably the best location for pictures. And I don't know, Chet, is there anything online that you've ever come across, or?
Not so much, but I really like Nora's book because she's got photos that you don't normally see of those species. Everybody knows what Western red lily looks like when it's in flower. And she may have that picture, but then what she focuses on is the seed capsule. She's got a photo of that, and this is for each species. She's got a photo of it in seed, which normally people overlook because it's not very showy, but for our purposes, we need to know what that looks like. A picture of the seed, like Renny had in his presentation, and then a picture of the seedling, like Renny had in his presentation. And she does that for each species. It's really lovely. It's a great resource. I can't think of any better single resource that brings so many species together like that. You might be able to find some on a website. I kind of caution against just Googling, Gaillardia seedling, because I've seen a lot of seedlings that are misidentified, on Google, if you just Google something. So I would go with Nora's book for sure.
There are so many more questions. I knew this was going to happen. Shall we answer two more? And then we'll have to say goodnight. And Sandra, maybe could you mute your dog?
I'll take them downstairs. You'll like them.
Okay, a couple more questions. How old or fresh should seeds be to expect decent germination in general?
We've actually had some wildflower seeds that we've had stored in deep freezer for 25 years. And the germination rate is when we pull it out and start those plants or those seedlings, we actually find germination rates are sometimes even higher than freshly collected seeds. So part of it is the storage of the seed. And what we typically do is if we harvest seed, once we clean the seed, we store it long-term in deep freezes, and not like your fridge deep freezer, but in cold storage like your chest freezers. And you can keep that viability up for quite a few years doing that. As soon as you keep the seed out, and if you're not keeping it frozen, you got to keep it in a cool, dry place where it won't, humidity won't get in, won't cause germination, sunlight won't get to it, and it's like your vegetable garden seeds. If you can keep them dry and cool, they'll last a lot longer as well. But what we usually tell people is if you don't get your seeds planted that year, put them in a Ziploc bag, throw them in the fridge or the freezer till next year until you're ready to go.
One more question then, and this one is for you, I think, Sandra. I'm interested in starting more edible native plants. I know of something, I think it's called Indian breadroot. Is there anywhere I can find seeds, and any recommendations for growing?
Yeah, Indian breadroot's actually kind of hard to find these days. It has a very symbiotic relationship with the bison, but it's not completely rare. I've collected seeds from places I've worked with permission. So, and they are very hard to get growing. And so what I've discovered is if you clip either end of the stalk on that bean and plant it straight into the soil where you tend to grow it, and it needs sandy soil conditions, it'll grow. And I've been very successful with it. It needs a well-draining area. It takes quite a few years for them to become that nice, lush plant that you see out in the wild, too, of course. But yeah, and then of course the insects that come to it, because it's a member of the lupin family. So you get another variety of insects.
I have an impending dog problem at this end as well. This is the problem with having our homes turn into studios. But I think we could go on with this for hours, but we've run just ever so slightly over time. And because we're all suffering from Zoom fatigue these days, I think it's time to thank you all very much for sharing your knowledge. We have some questions here in the chat still that we will attempt to find answers through over and share them over Facebook. So thank you very much to Chet Neufeld, to Renny Grills, to Sandra Walker, and to Amanda Farnell from the Saskatchewan Festival of Words, who has been working behind the scenes to keep everything streaming along. Thank you to all of you. By this afternoon, there were 231 people signed up to attend this event. So if you're interested in growing native plants and bringing this beauty back to the prairies, you're not alone. So thank you again for your interest and your participation. Be sure to look up the Pollinator Paradise YXC pages on the Wild About Saskatoon website, and let the gardening begin. Good night.